The horse moved slow under him, its hooves striking hollow against the hard-packed earth of the road. Evening light bled over the plains, turning the dust into smoke and gold, but Elias Ward rode with his head bowed, hat-brim shadowing eyes that had not known rest in years. The smell of leather and sweat clung to him, the faint rattle of his saddle tools marking him like a drifter with no home but the next mile. He had come only to trade, coffee, cartridges, tobacco, but the town was already watching. He felt it before he reached the first porch, eyes narrowing behind shutters, voices dropping into mutters. They knew him. Or rather, they knew the stories. That he had lived too close to Apache camps. That his wife had died on his watch. That a man who rides alone too long comes back a stranger. Rumors clung to him the way river silt clings to boots, and Elias had long since stopped trying to shake them off. The town's river crossing ran shallow, but the current was quick this season, restless from mountain snowmelt. He pulled his horse short when he saw a figure in the water, black hair loose, shawl tangled like a snare, body rolling in the current. For a moment it looked as though the river had claimed her, a woman half drowned and drifting toward the bend. Elias swung down without thinking, boots sinking into mud. The water bit cold around his legs as he fought his way toward her, catching her under the arms before the current could drag her under. She was lighter than he expected, limp as a broken reed. Her lips were pale, skin blue with cold. He pulled her to shore, kneeling in the reeds as she coughed up river water, eyes fluttering open. The town stood watching from the bridge and the bank, farmers, a few women with baskets, boys perched on fence rails. Not one of them moved to help. They kept their distance, whispering. "That's her," one muttered. "Half-blood widow." Best if the river had finished its work, another spat into the dust. Elias looked up, meeting their eyes, and they looked away as though his gaze carried plague. He gathered the woman, Naya, though he did not know her name yet, in his arms, her wet shawl soaking through his shirt. She trembled faintly, breath shallow against his chest. He carried her into town, each step heavy as though the eyes upon them added weight. The boarding-house stood at the corner, lanterns already lit against the coming night. Elias mounted the steps and kicked at the door with his boot heel until the matron came. She froze at the sight, Elias Ward, a stranger in his own land, holding an Apache widow limp in his arms. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her face was tight, torn between duty and disdain. Elias did not beg. He only stood, water dripping from his coat, until at last the woman fetched a blanket from inside and held it out with pinched fingers. Elias laid Naya down on the porch bench, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were half closed, lashes trembling, breath shallow but steady. He did not speak. Words seemed brittle things, unfit for moments where only silence bore weight. The matron frowned. "She shouldn't be here," she said under her breath, though she did not take the blanket back. Elias touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was neither thanks nor apology, only acknowledgement of her choice. He straightened, looking once more at the townsfolk gathering along the street, their faces pale in lamplight. None of them would forget what they had seen, Elias Ward hauling a woman from the river who belonged nowhere and setting her down under their roof. The sky deepened to indigo. Smoke from hearth-fires drifted low across the street, mixing with the smell of wet earth and horse sweat. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, his shadow cast long across the dust, and felt the weight of two lives bound in silence, not by choice, not yet by trust, but by the cold welcome of a town that wanted neither of them. He looked at her one last time, her braids loosened by the current, her fingers clutching the blanket as though holding on to the last ember of warmth, and something in him knew this was no passing moment. The river had not claimed her, and for that, both their lives had changed. The room smelled of damp wool and smoke, the kind of scent that lingered in walls long after firewood had burned to ash. Naya lay beneath a patched quilt, her hair undone, dark braids unraveling into long strands that glistened as they dried in the fire's glow. She stirred faintly, whispering words Elias did not understand, syllables of her people's tongue carried like fragments of wind. He sat near, knees wide, his hands busy with quiet work. A basin of water steamed beside him, a cloth folded over the rim. He touched her wrist with the gentleness of a man who knew the brittleness of things. When he drew back the quilt, his eyes fell upon scars, thin white burns across her arms, marks like the lash of rope or firebrand. Old injuries, healed but never forgotten. He did not speak of them, only wrung out the cloth and pressed it against her skin, as though silence could soften pain the world had long since etched into her. She woke, slowly, gaze unfocused, then fixed upon him. Her eyes travelled to his hands, large, rough, knuckles notched from years of work. She noted the missing ring, the pale groove left behind where gold once rested. And when her gaze lifted higher, she saw how his eyes flickered often toward the rifle propped against the wall, worn wood polished by years of use. He lived with danger always at his back, as though the shadows themselves had taught him not to trust stillness. Neither asked questions, yet answers passed between them in the quiet. He tended wounds without comment, she studied his silence and found in it the shape of her own. They were two people who bore the weight of stories others had told about them: widow, outcast, stranger. Scars on their skin, scars beneath it. When she could stand, Naya walked the town's edges, the hem of her shawl dragging through dust. The settlement was small, yet every step brought whispers. Children were called in from porches when she passed. Women shut their shutters quickly, their movement sharp as the snap of thread cut too short. Even the dogs lowered their muzzles, sensing what men carried in their hearts. Elias did not announce himself, yet he was there, leaning against a post while she walked, or following at a distance with his hat tipped low. He did not raise his voice when men muttered behind her, but the set of his shoulders, the calm steel in his eyes, was enough to send them looking elsewhere. It was protection without claim, a shield that made no promise yet refused to falter. One evening, as dusk fell like smoke, she paused at the far edge of town where the road sloped toward the fields. The wind lifted her hair, carrying strands across her face. Behind her, Elias stood with his arms folded, saying nothing. She turned just slightly, her eyes finding his in the fading light. For a heartbeat, it was as though they both recognized themselves in the other. Two souls who had been left behind, walking in the world like ghosts no one wished to see. Naya thought of her late husband's kin, who had never forgiven her for being born of a settler mother. She thought of settlers who looked upon her skin and eyes as proof of something unclean. Elias thought of his wife's grave, the soil hard-packed where he had laid her, and the nights afterward when no voice answered his. Their kinship was not spoken. It lived in glances, in the spaces between footsteps, in the way his shadow sometimes fell beside hers though neither reached for the other. They did not need words to know the truth, that the past clung to them like dust, and neither had found a way to shake it free. Yet in walking together, even in silence, the burden was no longer borne alone. The fire at night seemed warmer with her presence nearby, the rocking chairs creaked less hollow. Her breath softened the edges of his solitude, while his steadiness cut through the brittle air of her exile. They were not lovers, not yet, but something fragile had begun to root itself in the quiet earth between them, as though survival had drawn them into the same circle of light. The storm came without warning, rolling black clouds across the plains until the sky seemed to press its weight upon the earth. Thunder cracked like splitting timbers, and lightning bared the bones of the boardinghouse walls in harsh white flashes. Rain hammered the streetboards, turning dust to rivulets of mud that ran down toward the river. Inside, lamps shuddered in their sconces, flames guttering with each gust that rattled the windows. The door of the saloon burst inward with the wind, and a man stumbled through, half dead, his shirt torn, blood soaking the side of his ribs. He collapsed across the nearest table, scattering cards and tin cups. The tokens hanging from his neck glinted in the lamplight. Apache bone beads tied with leather, alongside settler tools stuffed into his belt, a mix of knife and stolen trinkets. A raider, a thief, or worse. The room filled with voices, sharp, accusing. Before questions were asked, the eyes turned on Naya. She had stepped in with Elias only moments before, rain dripping from her shawl. A woman hissed her name, spitting that it was her kin who brought raiders here, that she must have guided him to town. Others joined, mutters rising like smoke until the saloon thickened with suspicion. Naya stood very still, her face shadowed by wet strands of hair. Elias moved to her side, his voice low yet carrying like the weight of an iron gate shutting. He did not shout. He did not plead. He said simply that the wounded man had come on his own, and that blaming her was cowardice. His hand rested on the butt of his worn Colt, not drawn, but present. The calm in his tone was steel, the kind that steadies or warns. Still the mob pressed closer, voices hard with fear, fists clenching as if fear itself demanded blood. The storm outside shook the walls, lightning striking so near the air itself seemed scorched. Elias did not wait for the crowd to decide. He put his hand lightly on Naya's arm and guided her out into the storm. Rain poured down in sheets, cold as the river that had nearly taken her life. Their clothes clung to them, the shawl plastered to her shoulders, his coat heavy with water. The street was nearly empty, shutters barred, lanterns extinguished against the gale. Together they crossed to the livery, its wide awning their only refuge. The smell of wet hay and horses mingled with the rain, and the wind moaned through the rafters. For a long time neither spoke, only the storm filled the silence. Then Naya's voice broke through, soft yet sharper than the rain. She said she once wished the river had kept her, that being caught between two worlds was worse than drowning. She spoke of her husband's people, who never accepted her blood, and of settlers who would never accept her face. Her words trembled, not with fear, but with the exhaustion of carrying exile in her very skin. Elias listened. He did not tell her she was wrong. He did not offer hollow comforts. Instead, he shrugged out of his old coat, heavy and frayed at the cuffs, and placed it over her shoulders. The gesture was wordless, yet it carried the weight of truth. She was not alone in this storm. She pulled the coat tight, the warmth of it lingering even through the rain. Her eyes searched his in the flicker of lightning, finding no pity there, only recognition. The storm raged on, but within that narrow space of dripping eaves and steady silence, something held. Not hope, not yet, but the knowledge that survival meant more than just standing against the current. It meant choosing to stay upright when another had reason to let go. The thunder rolled farther into the distance. Rain still fell, but softer now, a curtain instead of a flood. Naya turned her face away from the street, pressing into the shadow where the lamplight did not reach. Elias remained beside her, his hat dripping, his rifle within reach though his hands rested idle. They did not need to speak of what had passed inside the saloon, nor of what tomorrow's whispers would bring. In the storm's wake, they had already learned the lesson the river had tried to teach them both, that to endure was not to stand alone, but to hold fast when the waters rose. The drifter lived, though barely, and the town shut him in the storeroom with chains at his ankles. His presence was a wound that would not close. Every man muttered that his beads and trinkets meant Apache ties, every woman whispered that Naya must have known him, that she had brought danger trailing behind her like storm clouds. The truth mattered little. Suspicion had already taken root. The boarding-house gave Elias and Naya a corner of its dim hall, a room meant for transients, not for people who linger. Still, they lingered. Night stretched long there, the rain's rhythm against the shutters fading into the steady hiss of firewood. The rocking chair spoke in its own language, creaking each time Elias leaned back, hat tipped low. Across from him, Naya sat quiet, the shawl drawn around her shoulders, her eyes catching firelight as though holding it against the darkness. They did not speak much, but silence between them was not empty. It carried the weight of yearning that had not yet become touch, of wounds that had not yet become scars. The air seemed thick with what neither dared to name. One evening, he spread his tools across the table, awl, needle, scraps of worn leather, the broken saddle he had carried since before his wife's death. Each piece lay like relics of another life. His hands moved with patience, as though stitching was prayer. Naya rose, shawl trailing, and after watching him in stillness, she placed a braid of horsehair beside the saddle. It was small, no larger than a child's hand, yet its meaning was weighty. In her people's way, it was a token of respect, a quiet gesture that said she saw his labor, his burden, and offered her presence to it. Elias looked at it for a long moment before nodding, the corner of his mouth shifting almost, but not quite, into a smile. At dawn, she woke to the smell of coffee. He poured it black into a tin cup, sliding it toward her without words. She wrapped her hands around the warmth, the steam rising between them, and for a moment the bitterness on her tongue felt like communion. Coffee for leather, silence for braid, these were their exchanges, small as embers, fragile as breath. Yet beyond the walls, danger pressed close. Riders came through the night, shadows on the ridgeline, sometimes settlers, bristling with anger, demanding vengeance for stolen goods, sometimes Apache warriors, eyes hard with grief, seeking blood for raids. The drifter had rekindled old feuds, and the town trembled like dry grass waiting for flame. Elias kept his rifle near, oiling the stock, testing the weight of cartridges. Naya listened to the hoofbeats outside, the calls that rose and fell, and knew that neither side would spare her if blood was called for. She was the reminder both hated, a woman who could not belong to one world without being cast out by the other. Still, under the same roof, they found a strange kind of peace. Trust grew between them not in leaps but in inches. The way he set his chair a little closer to hers each night, the way she folded his shirt after drying it by the fire, the way their eyes lingered longer before turning away. They both understood, though no words were spoken, that loneliness had been their truest enemy. It had hollowed them out, left them brittle, ready to break at the next cruelty. And now, in the quiet exchanges of horsehair and coffee, silence and watchfulness, they began to feel what it meant to be sheltered, not by walls, not by the town, but by each other. The drifters' chains clinked faintly in the storeroom below, a reminder of the storm still circling. But for that night, beneath the same roof, their shadows stretched long together, no longer standing alone. The night broke open with the pounding of fists on the boarding-house door. Shouts filled the street, voices jagged with drink and fury, torches flaring against the dark. Elias rose from his chair, rifle already in hand, the weight of it a familiar burden. Naya stood near the hearth, her shawl clutched tight, the lamplight painting her face in flickers. The mob outside roared for her blood. They called her a traitor, a lure, the cause of every raid and theft the plains had suffered. The matron whispered for Elias to let them take her, to end it before the house burned down. He did not answer. He stepped between Naya and the door, his frame filling the narrow hall, rifle lifted with steady hands that carried no tremor. The door shook as men pressed against it, cursing his name. When the board splintered, the firelight inside flared against the storm of bodies pushing through. The first shot cracked the air, a bullet shattering plaster near the hearth. Sparks leapt, wood splintered, smoke began to curl along the rafters. Elias fired once, the recoil deep in his shoulder, the man at the front collapsing into the dust. Still they surged forward. Naya moved without hesitation. She took the knife from Elias' belt, the blade glinting in the chaos, and struck at the man who tried to wrench the rifle from his grip. Her face was calm, her eyes fierce. She moved not like prey but like someone who had carried exile so long that fear no longer ruled her. Each cut was deliberate, each step sure. In that moment, she was no shadow hiding behind him, she was fire itself, standing beside him. The fight stretched into smoke and thunder. Gunpowder thickened the air, torches hissed as they fell to wet boards. When the drifter's chains rattled free, he lunged for a pistol, but Elias turned and shot him down with grim finality. The sound echoed like the end of a hymn. Then silence. The mob scattered into the night, leaving their dead behind. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons through the holes in the walls. The fire crackled low, casting a faint glow over the wreckage. Elias slumped against the table, blood blooming across his side. His breath came harsh, uneven, but he still held the rifle, as though his hand had forgotten how to let go. Naya dropped to her knees beside him. Her shawl tore beneath her hands, strips twisted into bandages that pressed firm against the wound. Her fingers trembled but did not falter, binding his flesh with the fabric that had so long marked her as outcast. Her dark hair fell across his chest as she leaned close, listening for the rhythm of his breath. He met her eyes once, lids heavy, and in that gaze there was no division left, no settler and no Apache, no widow and no stranger. Only two lives, bound in fire and blood, each keeping the other from slipping into the dark. Her hands stained red, she whispered nothing, for words would have broken the truth between them. The fire burned low, throwing their shadows together on the walls, one form indistinguishable from the other. And in that silence, both understood, the fire between them was not born of desire alone, nor of the storm outside, but of sacrifice. To stand side by side, to fight not for a place in the town, nor for acceptance by either world, but for each other, that was the only vow worth keeping. The first light of dawn spilled across the town like a slow tide, painting the broken windows and scorched boards in pale gold. Smoke still lingered from the night before, a bitter reminder of what had been fought and lost. Elias stood in the street, his arm bound by Naya's shawl, the rifle still slung across his shoulder though his body swayed with exhaustion. Beside him, Naya's eyes were fixed on the horizon, her breath steady, her posture unbent despite the bruises that darkened her skin. Then the riders came. A low thrum of hooves carried through the earth, a sound that made shutters tremble and hands twitch toward hidden pistols. From the east, out of the thinning mist, an elder led the line of Apache warriors, Naya's father. His hair was long, streaked with ash and silver, his eyes sharp as flint. He sat tall in the saddle, his presence heavy with the weight of judgment and years. The town held its breath. Mothers drew children inside, shopkeepers stood frozen in doorways, and men gripped the handles of their tools as if they were weapons. All feared the clash to come, for vengeance was the language the plains had taught them to expect. The elder dismounted slowly, his boots striking the dust with deliberate weight. His gaze traveled over the wounded settlers who lingered, over the bodies left in the shadows, and finally, to his daughter. For a moment, the air seemed to collapse inward. His face, hard as stone, softened when he saw her alive, her scars lit by the new sun. Naya did not move. She did not bow her head, nor step behind Elias. She stood where she was, blood and ash staining her shawl, and met her father's stare without flinching. She had been cast out before, left to fend between two worlds that claimed her and rejected her in the same breath. But now she was no orphan, no ghost. She stood as herself. The elder's eyes flicked to Elias, and the silence deepened. Here was the man who had dared to shield her, who had fought with her, bled beside her. There was no grand speech, no cry for war. The elder simply bowed his head, low, steady, reverent. It was not surrender, but respect. A recognition that strength had been met with strength, loyalty with loyalty. The town gasped in its silence. No one had expected mercy, least of all gratitude. And yet it came, quiet as the morning breeze. The riders wheeled their horses and waited, their eyes neither hostile nor kind, but patient. The choice was no longer about vengeance. It was about the path forward. Elias shifted, his side aching, but his hand was firm as he guided Naya toward his horse. She looked once more at the street, the place where shutters had closed against her, where whispers had carved her spirit raw, and then let him lift her into the saddle. His rough hands lingered against hers, not in possession, but in promise. When he swung up beside her, their silhouettes rose against the sky, outlined in light as the sun crested over the plains. The rifle at his back, her braid falling over her shoulder, two figures where once there had only been shadows of loneliness. The town watched in silence, caught between shame and awe, as the horse carried them forward. They did not ride away as savior and rescued, nor as settler and outcast. They rode as equals, bound not by law or blood but by choice, the rarest kind of bond. Ahead, the river glimmered, its waters alive with motion. Naya's eyes lingered on it, remembering the night it nearly claimed her, the moment she had thought the current was stronger than her will. But now the river was no longer a threat. It was a mirror, flowing relentless yet carrying with it the light of the morning sky. She leaned into Elias, her voice low, almost a whisper against the wind. He did not answer in words. His arm settled across her waist, his silence steady as stone, his presence the anchor she had always longed for. The horizon opened before them, wide and unbroken. Behind them lay smoke, judgment, and the ruins of what was. Ahead lay nothing certain, only survival, only the road, only each other. And that was enough. Healing, Naya realized, was not in erasing the scars, nor in pretending the past had not left its mark. It was in carrying those scars forward, walking, or riding, into the unknown with someone who had chosen to bear them too. The sun climbed higher. The river flowed on. Together, they rode toward it, shadows fading behind them, their path carved by belonging at last.